Hi, hello. Sorry, can we start, please? Hi, I would like to invite you all to this year's Pecha Kucha event, and it comes at a funny time because it's exactly at the middle of the year, so it's an opportunity really to see what's happening in the school, have a cross-section of the whole school. So we're going to have 12 units present, and then really reflect about what's happening in the school and what's happening outside the school with our guest panelists. And I would like to introduce a panel. Firstly, I would like to invite Odile Decq, who's the founder of the practice Odile Decq and Benoit Cornet, architects from Paris, and responsible for a wide range of international projects. And since 2007, she is the head of the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris. Then we also have Sarah Ichioka. She's the new director of the Architecture Foundation in London since August 2008, and also deputy director of the London Festival of Architecture. She previously worked as a consultant curator on several exhibitions, including the Global Cities at the Tate Modern and the 10th Architectural Biennale in Venice in 2006. We also have Richard Wentworth, who is internationally renowned artist who lives in London and whose work has been widely exhibited. He has taught at the AA in the 90s and is currently the Ruskin Master of Drawing at the Ruskin School of Art, Oxford. We'll also be joined by Alex de Rijke, who will be a little bit late today. He's just phoned me. Who is the founding director of de Rijke Marsh Morgan Architects. And finally, we have Peter Karl, who taught at Cambridge University Department of Architecture for more than 20 years, and now is Professor of Architecture at the London Metropolitan Architecture, and, in my opinion, has an encyclopedic knowledge of architecture. Okay, please welcome me in joining an applause for our guests. So, over to first year.
Hi, I'm Graham Smith. Instead of talking directly about our work or directly about the boom bling bust, we thought we'd sort of open it up for sort of a discussion group and do what we do best, which is talk. So, guys, George, how do you think your work is affected by the credit crunch and by bling boom bust?
Well, I don't think that our work is directly affected by it, but I do think that we acknowledge that there's something going on. But it isn't. I mean, I don't think that that the way we work or whatever we produce is really affected by what's going on outside.
Okay, Harry, any question?
World. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we really have sort of time to sort of be able to deal with these debates. I mean, we're just sort of getting used to all the concepts and all the drawings and everything. So it's really just exposure to everything, and you are aware of these things, but
and also I think there's a universal desire amongst like young students, first years, to like deal with these type of issues, but first year mostly is focused on the design process and actually looking at what's around us.
Okay, but if the media and the surrounding lifestyle, like you said, is saturated by this culture, how do you ignore it within your work?
I don't think we necessarily ignore it, but our projects are not designed to be looking at sort of real-world issues. We're playing around with materials, we're learning how to approach design problems, but none of them are necessarily ever going to be built or supposed to be.
I think the luxury of the first year is actually that we have the choice to approach this if we choose to do so or not. And it's very much a bubble, and I think that's actually the luxury of the first year, which might not be the case later on in our education. So it's the choice that's important.
Do you think, though, that we're looking at the model project, which is where we were given 3 objects: a bunny, like a plush toy bunny, a mixer set, and a baby's bib set, and we were told to abstract it at make an installation at 1 to 10, 1 to 100, or 1 to 1,000 scale. And everybody did these crazy, fantastical things. We'll see in a minute. Andrea made a sugar city that regenerates buildings made out of sugar and wax. Do you think, though, that this sort of fantastical reaction to the brief, do you think that's sort of escapism from, the credit crunch and the recession? Because it was about the same time.
Well, I think it's really important, especially in first year, to be able to escape from it and to be able to have that fantasy element, because we're probably not going to have it later on. And most of us haven't done any of this before, and we need to first learn to be creative and to do whatever we like, and then we can apply the rules afterwards.
Yeah, we'll get to it in 5 years.
We'll get to it in 5 years. But okay. Well, right now we're working on the fire station, though, right?
Yeah.
We're working on the fire station, and there's a parallel there between sort of this masculine, masculine sort of really functional building, fast-paced thing. Isn't there a parallel between that and sort of the financial sector, which is fast-paced, and, quite butch as well?
Well, there might be, but as first years, we can choose or choose not to apply that to our projects. And some of us are doing very accurate demographic studies of London, and some of us are doing completely ridiculous, sort of fantastical projects that we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be playing around and enjoying what we're doing, and that's what makes it fun, and that's what first year's about.
Yeah, I mean, what makes it actually interesting is that you're given a brief and you're told, okay, you're supposed to design a fire station, but then at some point, you begin to question whether you're designing a fire station or, I don't know, a theater piece. So it's kind of...
Yeah, well, I don't think sort of what we're meant to be dealing with is sort of completely realistic, design briefs. So I think it's, just trying to get used to everything, and then hopefully something will come out of it. And if you're able to bring some elements of what's going on outside of it, then you can do. But really, it's more about just sort of getting used to everything and just exposing yourself to architecture in general.
So you think then that sort of the realistic stuff, like the stuff that actually matters, will come later on in the diploma school and intermediate school? Hopefully.
Yeah.
I think it depends. Not all the intermediate projects necessarily are more realistic. I mean,
No, but as you go through the school,
yeah, you should be trained as an architect
But
by the end of it.
That's
Yeah.
what we do, right? That is the whole point of the AA, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do we consider the real world when we're designing projects? I mean, we're doing fire station again. I'm referring to that, but I'm designing a theater set. I mean, if I were in the real world and I said, okay, and I was given a brief to design a fire station, I came and said, this is the most amazing theater set I have ever designed. They're going to be like, well, I want a fire station. I don't want a theater set.
Well, I don't think any of our stuff is really responsible design. I mean, you hear so much about this in the media of, everyone looking towards being much more conservative, and realistically, I don't think any of that is really represented in what we're working on at the moment.
No.
Okay, well, that's just about our 5 minutes, and we don't really have that much time. But I don't really want to make any sort of sweeping generalizations about first year right now, but just to say that this is what we do. This is sort of the process. We're 66 people under one room. We're not in a 3x4 studio. So what we do is we talk, and that's what we tried to show today. Okay.
That's it.
Hello, my name is Ryan Dillon. I'm with Histories and Theories, and I'm going to talk about the concept of reinventing the contemporary. Political and sociological transitions fueled by turmoil have historically allowed architects to take inventory and reflect about now. Yes, sorry. This is the moment that rethinking current debates, language, design, theory, and practice, as well as their relations to each other, is critical to understanding today, with the goal to inform tomorrow. The question of reinventing the contemporary has a history. An example can be taken from post-Second World War industrialization at the turn of the 20th century. The invention of steel and concrete coincided with the need for mass production of social housing to reconstruct fractured urban fabrics by utilizing the advancing disciplines of engineering and industrialization. This became modern architecture. Modern architecture, at the turn of the 20th century, was an architecture that responded to cultural realignment through the tools of industrialization, engineering, mass production, and purification to construct a liberating, universal, modern architecture. And the image in the upper left corner is Maison Domino of 1914, which is Le Corbusier's structural design that led to the free plan and the facade based on the components of the machine age. And on the right is the city of 3 million inhabitants. A shift from modern to contemporary, 1954. The shift from modern architecture to contemporary, as penned by Siegfried Gideon in A Decade of Contemporary Architecture, and from mass production and universal industrialization, contemporary aligned itself with the devices of interior decoration, fashion, and consumer culture. On the next slide, there are 3 images. On the upper left is Archigram, bottom left is Philip Johnson in the Glass House, and on the right is that Charles and Ray Eames house. These images are all projects and examples that were completed around the time or shortly thereafter the 1954 shift occurred. The contemporary. Contemporary architecture spawns a diverse offspring of design methods that have transformed and fragmented during the past 50 years. This diversity of investigations forces us to reconsider the conditions of architectural practice, design, and theory. Architecture, in one sector, became an act of curatorial exhibition, constructing an atmosphere of sensational special effects. Architects as curators of surface. Architects have become the curators of surface, generating atmospheres that return a mood back to the observer occupant through special effects. This is the Blur building in Switzerland. The curatorial architects have exploded the idea of sensation and atmosphere. The surface has been removed. The effect is no longer tied to the surface, and the result generates an atmosphere of great effect, as the distance between cause and effect is a distracted vision. Legibility of surface disappears, and the special effect has been superimposed onto the observer through the coat, as seen on the left slide. In this case, to reinvent the terms of product, we must investigate the process and be critical of terms used to define the path taken to reach the product. To be clear, we need to understand process to better understand functionality of product. Another offspring of contemporary is design research through process. The making of forms are in relation to research of transition and change with the understanding that all things are dynamic and constantly evolving. The product is an artifact of the process. In the next slide, there are 2 examples of natural and biological elements that are typical and generic. And typical and generic elements are the base for the process that will generate a performance. Forms and behavior emerge from a continuous process of complex systems. These forms are produced by typical and generic existing components mutated and transformed by the process, which ultimately forms the product. In the upper left are human and insect mutation through prosthetic, and on the right is the complex system of an artificial eye. Finally, reinventing the contemporary. To understand what emerges from the process, architects must ask not how to define the terms of process, but also the terms of artifact. To understand all terms, we must ask ourselves to reflect how their meaning affects practice, design, and theory. Can we continue to use the same terms when our cultural surroundings and the architectural processes of now are changing at a rapid and violent pace? By rethinking the contemporary, we pause and question, what do the current cultural conditions expose in the architecture of now? The shift to a contemporary architecture has produced many processes that have altered the way theory, design, and practice interact as disciplines that generate product. The internalization of theory into practice and design process slices a duality that at once renders theory more relevant to practice, but also more obscure. Process and product are tied together through surface, through evolution, through theory, through text, through practice, and the culminating outcome is architecture. Our ever-changing surroundings of rapid growth is propagated by mass media, ecosystem, sustainability, and a host of evolving components that affect the complex system of architecture. The surfaces are multiplied: architecture, biology, media, urbanism, landscape, ecology, and beyond. As we transition through a moment of turmoil generated by culture, politics, and sociology, reinventing the terms and roles of process is critical, but only in the context of how that process impresses upon the product. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I'm representing Inter8 this year. I'll give a brief description of the unit brief and then show a few examples of the work. Intermediate 8 is looking at ways to rethink large-scale infrastructure through architectural intervention, questioning the scale and impact of a redundant built environment. The dam was given as a platform to propose a strategy to radically transform the ways in which infrastructure integrates and behaves as part of our extended urbanism. As the unit has been continuously focused on the role of computation in architecture for the past few years, developing the geometrical relationship to constitute parts of the brief has been very much encouraged. The given site is the Hoover Dam on the Arizona-Nevada border in the US, where each student is to produce an individualized brief for any type of intervention that critically assesses the site's current state. In relation to a developed strategy that responded to an individual design agenda, the following 3 projects will showcase the diversity of ideas and approaches from the group. Firstly, to emphasize in my project is the inherent implication of a megastructure, analyzing our responsibilities of scarring through the built environment. With the addition to existing structure, I am exploring methods of architectural discourse to encounter a distinct restoration or balance between man and nature. The argument I've produced within my brief is that a lot of our structures today are man building for man, and my project is an attack on that with man building for nature as well, as the Hoover Dam destructs a lot of the area around it, and from far distances all the way down to the ocean of the Colorado River. Also, I'll describe the other 2 projects as well. G, with her project, is taking advantage of the periphery functionality of site through a series of scenes to create a non-existing system, which essentially is a lookout for the dam. When we visited the dam, she found that actually there was no way you could see the downstream face of the dam, and therefore ways in which we appreciate the architecture or these megastructures that evolve is extinct, and therefore her project is to evolve this notion of looking at architecture in different ways. She uses a design strategy using sectional drawings as a code to evolve and analyze the form, structure, and geometrical logic of her lookout. She's been concentrating on the technical issues with building on the rock surface of the landscape adjacent to the Hoover Dam. Lara's project, finally, is concentrating on the construction process of the dam. It's taken as a project generator by reprocessing it both physically and conceptually. This is translated into a series of studies about buoyant structures as alternative mechanics for the medium of water, and using computerized fluid dynamics as inherent logic of the flow organization through diagrams. What we're trying to show here today is that even though our unit is quite well known for being a computerized geometrical enthusiastic unit, that we have many different approaches, and all 12 students in our unit have different approaches to the project, whether it's site, form, all different approaches. And yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Delaney, and I'm presenting on behalf of Diploma 2 and our attitude to Boom, Bling and Bust. And I'll be showing some example work at the end of the presentation. So, in this financial crisis, as governments take more control of the private sector, plans to invest in infrastructure, civic projects and energy efficiency are being considered to re-stimulate the economy. Consultant Paul Nakazawa suggests architects review their role as policy advisors to government organizations to mediate infrastructure development for a new green economy. Franklin Roosevelt used this Keynesian model to jumpstart the economy during the Great Depression. The New Deal initiated an ornamented Art Deco style of public architecture, observed by Keller Easterling as a new civic cultural identity born from the deal's increased budget and investment in infrastructure and public projects. Yet the New Deal also created big environmental problems, with miles of highway encouraging sprawl and destroying natural habitats. It is now the responsibility of architects to reconcile policy, design, and the natural landscape by advancing environmentally sensitive agendas, creating new green industries, employment, and supporting the view that ecological can be economical. Diploma 2's unit work is set in the dilapidated post-industrial Porto de Rio site in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Here the government is working to bring about new public works, yet these are not integrated with each other or with the local, informal, self-governed agencies. The question is how to better network between the public, private and informal sectors. The unit is focused on transforming the way infrastructure and public works are instated by looking at ways of creating multiple scaled micro-infrastructures and intermodal designs that interact with local cultures, communities and buildings. We hope to avoid top-down impositions similar to that of the elevated highway through the site in the 1960s. The unit comprehends the economic value of the government's existing proposals to improve the Porto, but criticises their disconnected locations and monolithic forms. We are designing an urban network of varying programs for infrastructure building hybrids, mediating formal and informal socio-economic, environmental and cultural organisations. We are proposing active programme hybrids for local community involvement. Projects include retrofitted bus and ferry terminals with formal and informal markets, a police station cultural centre, a light industry complex, a library publishing house, a running path sports links centre, schools, a regulated prostitution hotel and an urban farm. Our site visit highlighted examples of informal, self-governed agencies, NGOs in the favelas, small-scale commerce in the station, and community activist artists exemplified by Afro Reggae and the Samba schools. These grassroots organizations have proved to be successful in adapting to repressed economic climates and inspire our program mediation with the government agenda. In the Porto's favela, Tamim discovered an NGO running literacy school and clinics in dispersed shacks, whose wish was to introduce some textile industry facilities and a vocational school with a connection to the city. The project incorporates all this with terraced cells made of solar-orientated shell structures diffusing daylight, constructed with stones from the old quarry. The bus terminal below the highway lacks coordination between infrastructure, bus routes, informal retail and the hot climate. Fabricio is proposing ramped pedestrian channels to connect the lower streets to new upper bus platforms on the highway. His framework structure accommodates this in both informal and formal retail. The unit is examining environmental mediation to encourage ecological stability through lower building operation costs and waste reduction. Will proposes an urban farm to combat the global food crisis whilst creating new jobs and public space for the city. By articulating the urban realm, using solar-orientated light and wind chimneys, energy costs can be reduced. Observing that small-scale commerce existed under the shade of the highway, Asako created multiple ground circulation systems to extend an overcrowded ferry terminal to an underused plaza. By articulating the chimney type with light reflector components, diffused light and air are brought down to these protected multiple grounds, creating more areas for commerce. I ask, can culture play a role in economic stimulation? Rio's Carnival sustains a local economy of float builders, samba schools and tourism. Rio's landscapes promote an active outdoor lifestyle. My project choreographs ornamental landscape micro-sports networks with ground circulation routes for tourists and local inhabitants to challenge the monolithic stadium type. African Brazilian dance imitates the ecological flows of ground and gravity as demonstrated by local artist Ernesto Neto form fans sculptures. To protect local prostitutes, Anna is providing health and educational facilities with regulated trade structures as seen in Amsterdam. Her hotel and plaza are designed by choreographing intersecting minimal surfaces. Asako's ferry terminal mediates environmental, circulatory and commercial flows. In order to create sustainable intermodal structures which empower communities, the unit proposes governments follow the tactics of micro-agencies in Rio, who avoid susceptibility to big economic changes by being small, adaptable, and environmentally sensitive. It is our belief that employing environmental ornamentation can generate newfound civic value in the infusion of infrastructure, buildings, nature, and culture.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yvonne, and I will present on behalf of Interfor to show you a spectrum of work from our unit. Boom, beam, bust are three powerful words dramatically expressing three distinct states of a typical economic cycle. Boom is the top of the cycle, bust at the bottom, and the beam the turning point between the two. Each state had its own distinct characteristics, imposing limitations in some areas while opening up new potentials in others. As creative individuals, what we usually do is to explore the limitations, constantly exploring potentials and inventing new possibilities in order to improve or even to overcome the constraints eventually. This year, our unit's agenda is to explore the limits as a factor of creativity through the means of architecture envelope, which forms the physical boundaries or limits of any building. The agenda offers us a platform to directly confront with the physical constraints in searching for new design potentials and also an opportunity to rethink the whole concept of envelope in order to extend beyond the limitations imposed. Our unit methodology is a constant jog between the abstract generic and the physical specific. The generic aspect emphasizes an information and a rule-based design that reinforce systematic thinking. The rules are an abstract form of limits, yet open enough to allow individual inventions within its prescribed boundaries. We started by using existing urban codes as a platform to both understand and practice the principle of rule-based design. Each of us was given one of the 4 urban regulation codes of specific cities. This exercise was for us to both find the appropriate techniques for representing different types of limits, as well as to consider their influence on the physical built forms and the various conditions. We then moved from a top-down approach of the first brief, where the relationships embedded within the given rules generate information to inform the design, to a bottom-up approach, where fragments of information were given first. From them, combinatorial relationships were then extracted. We started with analyzing an urban moment, a slice of time that contains a wealth of events and potentials. Dense and specific information contained in the photographs serve as the base for the extraction and subjective reading of different layers of information that generate individualized hierarchy on the combinations. By re-establishing or shuffling the existing links to reveal new relationships, we also try to explore potential new spatial organizations. For example, in the following drawings, you will see the extracted relationships are translated into 3D diagrams that suggest potential spatial arrangements, such as this one, and also as these ones. This approach enables us to understand and extract relationships among multi-layered aspects of the city. Our own interpretations and arguments based on the common rules and site-specific information led to diverse applications and modes of visual representations. Paris, with its strong physical constraints imposed by the city regulations, is our base for exploring the limits while finding ways to convert them into a source of creativity. Ultimately, it's the ground for our research, which was carried out on multiple levels. Of the Parisian facade, we look at both their subjective aspects, such as narrative qualities conveyed by numerous elaborate ornaments, and their objective aspects, such as their typology, topography, and the natural dynamic factors that influence the performance aspects. Through these researches, we try to develop a series of representational and analytical tools to express and further understand multiple layers of contextual complexity that will eventually be translated into our envelope. At this stage of the year, we all have collected 3 tools, which will form the essential base for developing the forthcoming design proposals. First being the programmatic or organizational relationships, second being the study of a dynamic factor influencing the performance aspects of our envelope, third being the geometric dependencies, both translating these aspects and responding to contextual inputs. All these are tied up through the initial idea of a rule-based design process, which will enable us to combine these into highly diverse individual design proposals. Eventually, as a unit, we will combine our individual proposal to form a city block. One's own rules will also become someone else's limits. The ongoing negotiation among ourselves and the collective efforts of all our individual hands and minds will constantly manipulate the collective design outcome. And how well we work together as a group, as a whole, will ultimately determine whether our outcome is a boom, a beam, or bust. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nick, and this is Ed, and we're going to give you an overview of Dip 10. So direct urbanism is about appreciating the immediacy of social interaction. It's about understanding the systems and rules that derive from and implicitly affect the lives of people in the city. This year we're looking at localized current events in order to design a situation as a hub and a building as a hub. We are kind of cautious about the boom, bling, bust theme. I think that the distribution of sites and topics in our course has led us to think that broad narratives about economic fluctuations and the spectacle that ensues can act as an excuse, is related to, but can act as an excuse for deeper and more fluid processes. So in this film, I looked at the mechanisms behind something as theatrical as a demonstration response to bankers, and compared it to the much more habitual realm of behavioral zoning in estates on the edge of the City of London. The proposal seeks to use the physicalization of enclaves to kind of stunt the criminalization of spontaneous public gatherings and assembly.
Okay, so each year the unit undertakes a direct action workshop, and this provides an opportunity to unravel the reality of the city, and also a means to immerse and to instigate situations within the live realm at the non-scale. So here Amber's direct action plays with the kind of proximity and the privacy in Soho, so a hug in exchange for a secret. She went on to do an immersion in the sex industry, which uncovered the kind of social perimeter of the sex worker. So she enlisted in this website, and she kind of discovered the numerous interfaces of the sex industry. And the following direct action challenges the nature and the value of food spaces. So this really kind of questions these intermediary spaces in the city where you can only use them if you consume. The kind of topicality of the project was food to begin with, and the current event, the existence of food deserts in Hackney. And these concepts were expanded and addressed at 3 scales, so distribution at the urban scale, retail and wholesale at the architectural scale, and interface at the direct scales. And this kind of elucidated a set of props, agents, rules, and zones which can then be used to assemble a proposal at each of the 3 scales.
Skip the slide. In Somerstown, Corey is looking at kind of conventional bureaucratic ways of prescribing value in public spaces, specifically one that's so defined by its perimeters. So Euston, King's Cross, and a new high-security disease kind of research lab. So his proposal asks very specific questions about what is value, for whom, and how do you match the two. Here is an existing hub, Paddington Station, and Rory's current event is the forthcoming Crossrail. And his proposal seeks to expand the interactivity of the existing hub into an 800-meter catchment area to create a kind of functional territory that draws people into the existing hub. And Ron is looking at ways to equip the Royal Docks with services and facilities prior to the completion of large-scale urban development. So it's an explicitly intermediary proposal that seeks to deal with phasing strategies to create a network, a temporary network of social provisions.
Here, Larissa's immersion really kind of uncovers a gradient of perception along the Westway. So this is a kind of very initial sketch from her immersion mapping her perception of fear. And this really poses fundamental questions about how you deal with large-scale infrastructure in the city and how this creates kind of barriers and divides the city. So her kind of project also raises concerns about a sense of belonging, and this is kind of in relation to both physical and perceptual zones of exclusivity, participation, and control. And her proposed situation hub uses these mechanisms of social belonging to kind of serve to disinstitutionalize education. And here Steph is addressing urbanism of control and misuse in Dalston. So this really concerns the misuse of designated space versus the informal allocation of street vendor space. So really her proposal is using control and existing mechanisms of control to intensify interaction and fluctuation on the site. Ooh, let's skip the slide. And finally, this is an example of a completed direct project from last year. So here Rory identified problems inherent in the existing release of prisoners and the integration of prisoners into the borough. So what he did was take the prisoner induction manual and reverse the concept, creating a prisoner release manual. So it's an attempt to urbanize the individual. And finally, just to conclude briefly, what we're trying to kind of suggest is that regardless of the whole boom and bust condition, the live realm of the city will continually persist, and that perhaps now in the wake of the boom period there's a real opportunity to generate heterogeneous urban proposals that truly respond to and engage the direct city.
Thank you very much. Could I ask all the people that participated in the presentations to come here at the here at the front? It'd be quite crowded, but I think it would be nice. And maybe I could start when the people are coming here, just to ask the panel a question, which I find quite intriguing. I think it was very nice to see everyone addressing the topic, but I was intrigued to find out that the only group that really everyone tackled it through their unit, but in a way, the first year discarded that in a way and went for sort of a more self-analysis. And I think it's quite interesting to observe that, especially as you're the kind of the youngest people who presented. And I would really like to ask the panel what they feel about that, because I think there's a way of addressing the question through the unit work, and I think it's quite symptomatic that the first year chooses not to do that. And maybe I ask this question to start off with Peter, who's at the far end.
Right, I wasn't really listening. I was trying to get my head around what had happened. This is very testing. Oh, thanks very much. This may never work. That's all right. In many ways, the apparent naivete of the first year, we're just playing, has its backside as a kind of species of arrogance. We're free to play. And that the more we play, the more responsible we'll become, is the other way of reading it. And and that is why to come to the AA, why to sign up for the place in the first place, has a certain, as somebody said, that has a certain credibility. When you then see what happened subsequently, what we got was an interesting, I kept seeing two extremes, both of which I think come out of something like a recession, where particularly economic metaphors and the metaphors of how to see a whole, a city, a village, a community, a culture, in economic terms has dominated, i.e. is some sort of statistically described abstraction, as Zevos gets said, called a system. And so there was an awful lot of very abstract depictions of systems. And at the other extreme was quite the reverse, almost dérive, very of which the monument was clearly the woman trying on a life as a sex patron, as a kind of walk-in phone booth ad. And this extreme between a world understood as systems and a world understood as psychology is straight out of Adam Smith, i.e. what is least clear is what we have in common. Are we a kind of quantum froth of individuals and opportunities, and the best way to do it is to kind of diagram it? Or is there something in the huge scope for play that talks about deeper, more long-term, more Obama values? Or he seemed to feature quite little in this, except for the very first slide. I'll leave it at that. We also only get 2 minutes.
Someone want to go?
I want to ask a question to the first year, because you were discussing and debating and expressing your ideas about what is for you architecture or the studies of architecture and what are you doing here. And it's much more about you have to improve your creativity in a way. So I have a question, because you were listening all the others after that. So you were until the Diploma Unit, so you have a large panel of what happens after what you are doing today. And so how do you think that your creativity will address the new world of today? Because you are the new world, you are the future architect for today. So I would like to, because I continue your discussion.
Well, hopefully that'll perhaps translate into becoming more resourceful and, just thinking of ways to get around issues and problems that we're going to encounter in projects later on. But I'm not sure how it's going to translate directly. Maybe that foresight's not so clear at the moment.
Can I? It's a really mean thing to ask you, but to sort of pursue exactly this. When I was in that the equivalent position, I now realise that there were people I wanted to be like. Would any of you risk that? It's effectively an editorial question. I mean, for me, the whole thing was incredibly interesting editorially. I don't know how you chose 1/10 of your year. Your whatever you are, you're a tenth of the whole year, I think. Very interested to know what the dynamics were. I was dying to know what you'd been talking to each other before. Whether you'd written yourselves lines. How playful it was.
And maybe Was it your idea to do this, or were the tutors involved in this decision?
I think actually that's the interesting part. I think it was more like a collaboration. Just what do you think? No, seriously,
Well,
I'm interested to know what you think.
I need to know what you think before I tell you what I think. I mean, it's a quite strange thing to be present at a children's party. I mean, it's absolutely not patronising. In fact, it's a pleasure. But I was incredibly aware of all sorts of little tensions that were running around, and I was thinking, shit, these guys tried to prepare for this, or didn't they? Or, I want to know more about the energies that are stored up outside the room. You have to imagine that I'm somebody who just fell through the roof wearing a parachute.
Well, we actually decided to make it a discussion, and we didn't rehearse that much before. We talked about it, so we know how it would be and how long 5 minutes was. But it was really important to us that our presentation of us would be our opinion about this, because we got the theme and our work doesn't relate to the theme. So instead we talk about why it doesn't relate to the theme we got.
Just to go to the other end of the spectrum, I had a question for Diploma too. What I thought you stood in probably the most marked contrast to the first years in terms of this very, quite noble, earnest exhortation of the architect's responsibility in social, economic, cultural matrices. But wondered if you had any feelings of envy or nostalgia to this kind of first year field of zero responsibility, maximum self-exploration, etc. Or if there was indeed an element of that in your unit's practice that just hasn't made it through the final edit to what we've seen today.
Yeah, really to respond to that, I think that we all sat down and had a debate and a discussion with the unit and tried to think how our work was most relevant to the discussion of today, to Boom, Bling and Bust. And although we worked quite tight schedules and things and productivity, we definitely have an element of play, but it's perhaps not as free as the first year would be, in the sense that we hope we've had our first years and now we feel like we're refining our work before we go on to maybe get a job.
I have another question for Ryan. Just listening to your fellow students' presentations from the different units, your presentation touched so much on vocabularies and syntax of how we talk about architecture and design, and wondered if you had any comments really about the words that some of your fellow students were using in describing their work. I think maybe if I could push it in one direction, to, particularly the study, kind of parametric study of Paris that was shown, for example.
Well, I don't think I have a comment on the specific words that have been used, but my comment in sort of the tone of what I said is the importance at a time like this when there's a recession and practice sort of takes a halt and theory becomes pushed to the forefront a little bit, that we re-look at these words that are being used that sort of fly off the tongue and maybe aren't being understood or explained properly. So in terms of the project in Paris, again, they're talking about systems and how systems function together, and I'd be interested to hear how they're actually understanding those terms that they're using and how and they should be specific about those terms.
But could I just be a little bit more specific about your case? Because you spoke a lot about reinventing the contemporary.
Yeah.
But when I saw your slides and your presentation, I thought it's always the contemporary is reinventing art. And somehow what you was presenting and your explanation, there was some slight contradiction, and seeing also what the other people have presented, and where they're kind of trying to reshape the contemporary in light of what you said. Do you feel there's a contradiction there, or do you feel?
What I showed is an attempt to sort of give a history of reinventing contemporary and a history of
where we are and how we got to where we are, and how at this moment we can use that history and reinvent, look at the terms we're using, look at the methods we're using, and I see a lot of disjunction between the methods that are being used, between process and product, and we need to sort of be able to define both of those specifically together. So we don't have the benefit of projects like the other sections. So we're text and words. So so I picked the images to try and go along with the text.
Do you think that might make you more missionary?
Yeah, possibly, yes.
Because
I think so.
I mean, a very broad thought was, as students of very different experiences, what an amazing opportunity to have 150 people to tell them.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we just finished our first term. We're going to our second term, and I think there's a hopeful push from my classmates in histories and theories, and we're hoping to become more involved with the school and involved with the projects going on. So we can comment and be critical and write text on what they're doing and have an understanding of how they're attacking through actual projects the current conditions. So yes, in that sense, that's something we hope to expand upon.
Because I mean, I'd like to just take that and just take it up a half step, which is that, for all of you, it's a kind of proselytizing moment. And some of you, of course, had to represent other people, which I think is a very sophisticated thing to do, even-handedly and with flair. But I'm amazed how rubbish some of the images are. I love to look at pictures. I'm a human. I don't go to the world and go, pictures, text. I'm struck by things, or I'm not struck by things. I'm stuck with being in my culture. But, this is such a sophisticated place, and I think I know nothing about the digital equipment, but I'm kind of going, what? This is like a bad airport, and I'm going to miss my flight. And I think you should be really critical of that. Really, some of you must have been really disappointed. You must have gone, but that's a wonderful. And then there it was, all juddering around. I think these are really. That's like not being able to pronounce a word. It's painful, and architecture's visual. It's physical and visual.
Maybe Sarah, do you want to contest that?
Were my images that bad?
No, but
yours particularly.
Cheers.
He said.
Well, in our, I suppose, in our unit this year, we're concentrating on very image-based production of processing drawings, imagery, anything that can explain the project as after all, architects don't just draw the plan and section that you may have seen on our presentation. I didn't actually show some of the imagery that we've been working on, but it's a process that we're going through currently. So I think that actually in our slides we may have shown quite a few different variations of the way we present that work, and different people had different geometries, not just a snapshot of Rhino. They were actual images that they'd worked on, to whether it was to make it look realistic or to keep it superficial to understand one certain part of the project.
But would you feel sorry if people like Richard say these things about your project? Would you say that these people are too romantic in a way, too nostalgic, and the future is what you're offering?
No, I think that, as we saw a few of the images in the histories and theories, there was some very traditional, what you'd call architectural drawings. And I think we have to realize that we're at a stage now where there's so many different processes of creating a projection of the work that you're producing, and therefore it's that projection that we've got to realise that we're at a stage that may not be the plan and section anymore.
I think
But
Peter's...
If I say fuck the process, what do you answer to that?
Sorry, what did you
Fuck the process. I don't want to listen about process. I'm not interested about listening about process and explaining, etc. I want to dream. Today I want to dream.
I think then it depends on whether you're showing the end of a project. I mean, I don't believe that at this school you ever come to the end of a project. The project just continues, even if it becomes onto a different subject. So I don't think we can give you the final dream image of what it is. It is a
By
process.
chance, I have no one final image for dreaming. The dream is larger. No?
I just want to... I feel we might never speak to each other again, and it's his fault. It wasn't about style. It was actually just to say, this is probably the best lecture theatre in London. It's probably one of the most sympathetic places that a lot of people can gather and look at something. It's really unusual. And of course it's an accident of fiddling with an old building. But that's quite a big picture. And when you discuss what goes on there, you need to test it, think about it, enjoy it. You know, you're ordering a meal. You don't want to kind of go, oh no.
You have the recipe but not the meal.
Sorry?
You have the recipe but not the meal.
Well, this is dream speak. The recipe and not the meal. It's not directed to yourself. I think it's a very broad. There were moments. I mean, you present. You should go into broadcasting, Lady in Red. I mean, I thought you were just kind of.
Where?
For 9 years.
CNN or?
No, Al Jazeera. No, that was not. That was. This is getting silly. I mean, I'm interested to encourage people. I'm not here to put you down. But I think it's very. That's a big opportunity. This is a big opportunity, and that's why I brought the subject of missionary work up. People can become incredibly interested in somebody else's work. You can discover that you're doing exactly the same as somebody else somewhere else in the school who doesn't even know it. It's a really fabulous moment to kind of do that, and that's visual primarily. That's all I'm saying. So I keep directing myself to these poor women. Of course.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, Richard, but I wonder if some of it's about just thinking a little bit more about how you distill it down, and if one's using the food and cooking metaphor, it's kind of getting it down to that one hit, that taste, if it's kind of a tapas style portion and given this format. And I actually think, the Pecha Kucha format was all about getting creative people to avoid giving these long monologues, but actually just really distilling their design ideas down to the minimum of powerful images. And I think that has an extension as well in how what the very core of the arguments that you're asserting. And I would say even for the first years, part of experimentation isn't just going like this out to thousands of options. It's possibly picking a few that really interest you, picking them, committing to them for a bit, provoking other people to either agree or challenge you on those, and then going on to new things from that. So in agreement about the visual, also perhaps comment to many about distilling down to one point. And with that, I should be brief with my own.
So I just have maybe one question to Odile. We saw the last projects we saw in Diploma 10, an incredibly articulate look at how London is controlled.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach this type of work with the words that you just said that you want to dream?
How to escape. About the control.
From the CCTVs.
Yes, exactly.
I think there's, it has to be said that as long as I've known the AA, which is embarrassingly long, it's always had this future anxiety where you sort of, the students go home and think, you know, whether they're drawing or doing the math, you know, this, I am the future. And there's this kind of burden about a new paradigm release. But if one stands back, the kind of period that we're going through now, I mean, I really loathe isms, but I'm going to use some. The scientism of the 50s was a period which generated the first phase of diagrams, which you guys picked up about 10 years ago as a reaction against the period that followed the diagrams, which we can roughly call postmodernism, which, you know, began with the eco movement and began to move into cities and history and kind of evaporated into semiotics and linguistics and, you know, another theater for private performance. And certainly one of the ways of coping with what's happened, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in some of the DIP 10 investigations, and actually some of the DIP 2 stuff where, you know, it starts off as dance, and I say, ah, that's got a whole life in the town. And then immediately it's turned into something, you know, the scale of the Lee Valley, you know, and it becomes kind of one idea from top to bottom. And I think this business of finding, you know, living in the interstices of the incredibly fragmented topographies that late capitalism has thrown up is something you're all kind of working with in your own ways. But it's like you also want that capacity to stand back and be able to diagram it, be able to instrumentalize it so that, you know, it'll sit on the screen and, you know, wiggle and vibrate and become 3D and, you know, all the rest of it. And I just wonder if some of the things that are being said about dream and so forth don't really come out of these, really burying yourself in these more concrete worlds. I mean, some of the stuff that's coming out of DIP 10, you know, when I call it a derive, this is one of those postmodern techniques that situations that people picked up on, and a lot of people lost because they didn't know quite what to do with it. Was it Dada? Was it private performance? Was it communicative? They didn't, you know, it was a very sort of provocative, and people tried, units tried to turn it into strategies of investigation. I think there are many, many, many more, and it's, you know, how to handle that moment where you say, I'm going to put it in a diagram and it'll all be understandable. It's actually less understandable as a diagram than it is on the ground. And that's a funny moment to me. I mean, whether it's ugly or not, actually they're quite beautiful in a sort of haunting way, but they're also they're sort of repetitive, like the stock pages. You know, there's this, who's the artist who keeps using, you would know, the artist who uses the stock pages all the time?
There's lots of them.
Yes, this is probably true.
Just to respond to your kind of comments, I mean, particularly through the work of DIP 10, as you said, we kind of find it very difficult. We're very cautious to reduce things to diagrams because I think it's very problematic to reduce the city down to a kind of defined diagram, and that's why we draw upon, we try and draw upon a whole kind of plethora of resources of the city. So we do immerse and we do direct actions and we kind of we do derives and so on. So we're kind of using the tools of the situationists, of course, and I think only through this kind of mix of image, of photograph, film, of kind of drawing, and you know, even we would draw upon the kind of news cuttings, and you know, there's so many resources that the architect can draw upon. Yeah, it seems a shame to reduce it to the diagram.
I think one of the big struggles, a lot of the drawings you saw were working drawings. I mean, they're not even,
yes,
they're
it very
instruments.
much has to be said, this is halfway through the year. That's a very good point.
But yeah, besides that, there were tools. I mean, there were snapshots of tools that we're developing. But I think one of the struggles of the unit is walking the fine line between, I guess it could be called a kind of structuralist imperative about rules and systems, and not becoming kind of deterministic about our role in kind of fidgeting with them from the top. So that kind of, the balance, I think, kind of avoids.
Yes, structuralism is one of those 50s products as well.
Yeah, I know. I mean that in the sense that that we deal with rules and systems, but we do not over-attribute their kind of influence. We don't see them as kind of hegemonic or as kind of all-controlling. So that's how kind of perception can come into it, or the kind of hard to describe effect of an immersion in understanding a situation.
Yes, this game of rules and systems is interesting, you know, because that's not the only form of order. I mean, there are forms of disorder that are more orderly than the systems are actually it's like being mentally defective to operate like a system, if you see what I mean.
I think
I was intrigued by I think it was Inter 4 who went into building codes, because these are supposed to represent common to all, you know, they're actually fairly ambitious. They end up being full of safety so that nothing ever goes wrong. It's like architects' renderings, you know, it's always blue sky, everything works, so on and so forth. But the idea that they become slightly demonic and they begin to dream, they begin to go back into, you know, why do this? Why not have a city that looks like, I don't know, most FPSs, you know, you just get endless architecture in tunnels. When they become just pattern, it's like there's this, or I got the feeling, I'm sure wrong, that was the end of the interpretation, that it was sort of enchanting in its own right, whereas there's a whole, just like behind something like the dance in Carnevale, there's, you know, a whole set of institutions that are located in parts of towns, and they're full of aggression, and, you know, there's a life. So are policies, so are things like building codes. That they come to these abstractions is probably, you know, the tip of a much more interesting iceberg. And I thought some of the strategies of Div 10 were looking at those, and actually I thought some of the stuff sorry, this is all happening at once. Div 2 is doing that. Sorry, I'll stop.
I'll stop you. I'll be a little bit Swiss here. Thank you very much, and we're going to pass on.
Sorry.
We're going to pass on to the next bunch, but thank you very much. And
you're right.
could I